offering a new report called The Houses of Life. And this report evaluates and explains each of your 12 houses and each subtopic of each house. So let's talk a bit and let me share some of the techniques and systems that drive this unique report. In the previous episode, we talked about how to calculate the functional nature of a planet, whether it's going to function benefically or malefically for the ascendant of the chart based on which houses it owns. So in this episode, we're going to go further with that technique. Now we're going to use that technique, and we're going to calculate how much impact the functional benefics and malefics have on each house. And the ever-fascinating Marilyn Monroe is going to help us by being an example chart. So here is a very broad, quick, confusing overview. What you'll do is, for each house, you'll then go through each planet. And for each planet, you need to know the amount of influence the planet has on the house, and I'll explain how you figure that out next. And then you take that value and you multiply it by the planet's dignity. So the amount of impact the planet has on that house multiplied by the mood that the planet is in, positive or negative mood, multiplied by their functional benefic or malefic nature. That little formula right there will give you the basic condition of the house, which is the starting point for the full evaluation of the conditions of every house. So let's talk about each one of these three things in detail so they become a little bit clear. So how do you figure out the amount of influence that a planet has on a house? It's actually simple if you know how to do aspects. Because basically the amount of influence that a planet has on a house is just the amount of aspect that it has on the house. How does a planet aspect a house? It has to aspect a point, and the point is the cusp of the house. In a whole sign system, the cusp is the defining point, which is more like the front door of the house. So the cusp of the house actually is quite simple to understand. It's just you take the ascendant's degree, and that's the cusp for the first house, and then the same degree in the next sign is the cusp of the second house, etc. So in Marilyn's case, 13 degrees Leo is the first house cusp, it's the ascendant. 13 degrees Virgo is the second house cusp. 13 degrees Libra, the third house cusp. Like I said, if you don't know how to calculate aspects correctly, degree-specific Vedic aspects, just look it up on my YouTube channel. I have videos dedicated to that. Now there's one other way besides aspects that planets can influence the house, and that's by being in the house. So those are called conjunctions. The conjunction with the house, mathematically or theoretically, works almost exactly the same as the aspect does. It's just add a new point in there, just to find that 0 degrees from a planet has 100% effect. There are, however, two differences that I want to mention. There may be more than two differences, but there's two differences that I utilize in my report between conjunctions and aspects. And the first one is, unlike aspects, the sign borders affect the potency of a conjunction. So if a conjunction is spanning across a border, you have to half the value, take half the value. And there's something interesting that happens when you have multiple planets conjoining one point, which doesn't happen if multiple planets are aspecting the point. What happens is the planet that is the closest to the point dominates the conjunction. So it steals or takes influence from the other planets. So that's why Marilyn Monroe has a huge influence of the sun on her 11th house, for example. 131% influence. How did that happen? It's because it's sharing Gemini with Mercury, but the sun is at 10 degrees and Mercury is at 7 and the cusp is at 13. So the sun is closer to the cusp than Mercury. So the sun is dominating the conjunction on the 11th house, so it's taking some of the potency from Mercury. Mercury's losing some of its potency to the sun. Same thing happens with her moon in the 7th house. The moon and Jupiter share Aquarius, which is the 7th house, but the moon is at 19 degrees, Jupiter at 27, and the cusp is 13. So the moon is closer to the 7th house cusp than Jupiter. So the moon is more dominant on the 7th house than Jupiter, and therefore it's represented mathematically by taking away numbers from Jupiter and adding it to itself. That's why the moon's impact on the 7th house is also over 100%. It's 107%, as you can see on the table. All right, so that is how you calculate or quantify the amount of influence that a planet has on a house. It's the aspect or the conjunction that the planet has to the cusp of the house. Now, how do you use this value? You're going to multiply that against the dignity. So let's first talk about how you calculate or quantify dignity. By the way, dignity is a measure of how the planet will behave. Is it behaving well or not well? Like if you're undignified, you do nasty things, and if you're dignified, you do helpful things. So we're going to quantify the dignity on a scale between -1 and +1. And these are the possible dignity states. Exaltation is the highest dignity, and it'll get a value of 1. Maryland doesn't have any exalted planets. Then a planet can be in a Mula sign. If you don't know what a Mula sign is, just look through my videos on YouTube. It's a domicile of the planet, but typically it will be the male domicile. It's usually the male domicile. She doesn't have any planets in a Mula sign either. The next dignity down is domicile, to be in your own sign. And that would be a 0.8. You can see that Mercury, she's got one planet, Mercury, in the 11th house in Gemini. So that Mercury has a 0.8 dignity value. Then a little bit less dignified than domicile is to be in a sign where you feel very friendly towards the host. The host is the planet that owns the sign. If the planet feels very friendly or not so friendly or inimical to the host, that causes the planet to have different types of dignity. Okay, so she's got one planet, Mars, that's in the very friendly dignity. It's in Pisces, which belongs to Jupiter, who is Mars' natural friend. And then Jupiter is close by, but not too close. He's over in Aquarius. So that makes the friendship improve to be very friendly. A little less than very friendly is just plain old friendly, which is a 0.04. She's got 3 planets in friendly dignity. So we'll take, for example, the moon. The moon is in Aquarius. It's naturally neutral to Saturn, but Saturn is within 3 signs of it. Saturn is over in Scorpio, so the neutrality improves to friendship. So it gets a 0.4 score. Then a planet could be a neutral dignity, which none of her planets are in. And then a planet could be an inimical dignity, which her sun is in. So the sun is in Gemini, which is Mercury's sign. The sun is usually neutral to Mercury. But because Mercury is right next to the sun, they're too close together, it makes the dignity go down 1 step. So it becomes inimical. So the sun's dignity value is -0.4. Then you could be very inimical, which is the case for her Saturn. Saturn is the worst dignity in her chart. Saturn is in Scorpio. Saturn's relationship with Mars is naturally enmity, and then Mars is far away. So it makes it worse. So it becomes very enmity, very inimical. Saturn feels very inimical towards its host. That affects its behavior. And then the lowest dignity would be -1. It's fallen or debilitated or Nietzsche. And she doesn't have any of those either. So this is just the scale that we'll rate the dignity on. And since we are just going for a house assessment in the main chart, we're not going to care about the dignities from the Vargas, from the Navamsha, etc. You may want to try that. If you master all these techniques, you may want to experiment with including that. But I didn't because we're evaluating the bhavas, which is the house. So we want to know the dignity for the house. Now, what do you do with this value? Every planet now has a value, -0.4, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. What do we do with these numbers? They're going to have an effect on the planet's amount of influence, right? The amount that the planet influences the houses is going to be multiplied by their dignity. But the type of effect is going to depend upon whether the planet is functionally benefic, malefic, or neutral. So to explain, if the planet is functionally positive. So let's say, for example, the Sun. So her Sun, for example, or Mars or Jupiter, Venus, those are functionally positive planets. If that functionally positive planet has a positive dignity, then it can double the impact of the positivity. So, for example, Mars is a functionally positive planet, and it has a positive dignity. So whatever impact Mars has on something, it can be doubled, because it's not only a functionally positive planet, it's also a functionally positive planet in a good mood. Now, the good mood is a value of 0.6. It's not 1. It's not 100%. It's 60%. So it wouldn't double, but it would be 60% of doubling. And that's how you're going to do the math. So if the planet is functionally positive and it has positive dignity, then the positive dignity fully intensifies the positive impact of the planet. If the planet, like this, in her case the Sun, if the planet is functionally positive but it has a negative dignity, it will not become a negative planet. It's still a functionally positive planet, but its positivity is diminished by the negative dignity. So the negativity can half the impact, as much as half the impact. Okay, so that's the effect that the dignity has on functionally positive planets. It's the opposite if it's a functionally negative planet. So in that case, if you're functionally negative like Saturn, in her case, and you have a negative dignity like Saturn in her case, then you will as much as double the impact, the negative impact. And if you're a functionally negative planet like the Moon, in her case, but you have positive dignity like the Moon, then the negative impact of the planet is reduced by as much as half. So this is how dignity affects functionally positive and functionally negative lords or planets. Now, what about functionally neutral? Like Mercury in her case. If you're functionally neutral, then the dignity can double the impact. So if it's a neutral planet, the dignity can as much as double the impact, and then whether the impact is positive or negative is not decided by the functionality, which is neutral. It's decided by the positivity or negativity of the dignity. So in her case, Mercury is functionally neutral and it has a very positive dignity, 0.8, most dignified planet in her chart. So the impact of Mercury on anything in her chart is going to be multiplied by 80% and made positive. Now, how do we use the dignities as a scalar? I'll give you concrete examples now. Let's just do this for her first house and just for the unique planets that affect her first house. Sun. So you can see it says that the Sun is influencing her first house at 30%. So Sun, we're going to start off with the value of 30% influence on the house, on the first house. Its dignity is -4. And its nature is positive. It's the first lord, so its nature is very positive. Functional nature. So the negative dignity, the effect of a negative dignity on a functionally positive planet is to reduce the impact by as much as half. So the math looks like this. The impact is 30. The amount that could possibly be reduced is half of 30, which is 15. But the actual dignity is 0.4. So 0.4 times 15 is 7, and 30 minus 7 is 23. And that's the impact of the Sun on the first house. It's not finished yet, but this is the 2 of 3 steps. Now, the moon has 80% influence on the first house. Why? Because it's almost opposite to the ascendant. The moon's dignity is 0.4 positive, but it's functionally negative. So since it's functionally negative, the positive dignity will reduce the negative impact by as much as half. So the math looks like this. Now let's look at this for Saturn. Saturn has 87% impact on the first house. Why is that? Because it's nearly exactly square to the ascendant. And Saturn has 100% impact on the far square, 270 degrees. So a big 87% influence, a very dramatic minus 0.7 dignity. Its nature is negative. So it's a negative, functionally negative planet with a negative dignity. So the negativity of the dignity is going to increase the negative impact by as much as full. So the math looks like this. It's 87 plus as much as 87, but actually 70% of 87. And so the value works out to be 148. Another situation we haven't covered yet is illustrated by Jupiter. Jupiter has 53% influence on house 1. Its dignity is 0.4, and its nature is positive. It's functionally positive. So the positive dignity increases the effect of a positive functioning planet. So the math looks like this. It'll be 53 plus 40% of 53, which equals 74. And finally, for this neutral thing, let's look at our Mercury. Mercury's got 35% impact on the first house. Not that much. Its dignity is 0.8. Its nature is neutral. So the dignity is just going to increase it. So you're just going to get 35 plus 80% of 35, or 63%. Okay? Now, let me show you what to do with these numbers, the 23 for the Sun, the 64 for the Moon, the 148 for Saturn, 74 for Jupiter, and 63 for Mercury. What we'll do with these numbers is multiply, this is the simplest part, multiply them against the functional nature of the planet. So, the Sun, the functional nature is 3. It's the first lord, it's the most functionally benefic planet. So its impact, which on the first house was 23, you multiply it by its functional nature and you come up with the value of positive 72. So the Sun's influence on Marilyn Monroe's first house is positive 72%. 72% positive. The Moon's, the impact when it was factored against the dignity was 64, but it's functionally a -1 malefic, so it becomes minus 64. So the Moon's impact on the first house is negative 64% negative. Another planet we covered was Saturn. Saturn had 148% impact on the first house, and its functional nature is -2. So it's minus 296%. So it's 296% negative impact on the first house. Huge negative impact on the first house from her Saturn. Jupiter, its base score was 74, and it's functionally a positive planet of 2. The value of first positivity is 2. So 74 times 2, Jupiter's impact on the first house is 148% positive. And then Mercury, it gets a positive 1 because its dignity is positive, and it's functionally neutral, but its dignity is positive. So 63 times 1 plus 63. So you just do that for all the planets, the ones that we didn't do as well, and then you just average them all together, and you'll get the amount of positivity for that house. How positive is that house? And in her case, it's 5% positive for the first house. And then you just do the same thing for every house, and it looks like this. Now I just want to give you one note, that the functional nature of the planet, there'll be one exception. The one exception is that the lord of the house will always be functionally positive for that house. And the value of the positivity is +2. So for example, Saturn in her chart is really heavy duty bad. It's giving, as you can see on the table, it's giving a lot of negative influence to every house almost. But when you get to 6 and 7, all of a sudden it's giving positive influence. That's because Saturn owns houses 6 and 7 for a Leo ascendant. Same thing with the Moon. You can see it with the Moon. The Moon's giving slight negative impact to all the houses except the 12th house because it owns the 12th house. So the functional nature of a planet, whatever it is for the ascendant, will be always +2 when you're focused on how it affects its own house. That's one final note. And another thing you might say, well, this is Marilyn Monroe. Why is her first house so bad? Why isn't her first house like huge? She's a sex symbol. Well, that's not really what the first house is about, my friends. Yes, the first house can certainly be important. Is one very important way you can get beautiful people. Beautiful and sexy are two different things. They're related, but they're not identical. Beauty itself is actually even more of a fourth house concern than a first house concern because beauty is feminine. First house is masculine, fourth is feminine. But really what I think is really interesting, and this is what I just said before, beauty and sexy are not really identical. Marilyn Monroe is very sexy. She's coming out of the gate roaring. She's a go-getter. She's very upfront about being excited and wanting to attract people, and that's what makes her so sexy. If you look at this assessment, which is not the final assessment, this is just the first step on the basic. This is the first step of your first impression of the houses. There's going to be like 7 more steps involved before you get a final conclusion about the houses. But just the way that the first step evaluation of our houses look like, you can see third house is third house is the dominant house. Third house is lust and ambition and bravery. And you can also see the 11th house is really there. So third house combining an 11th house and 5th house. 3, 11, and 5 all being strong in one chart. This is a person that's really, really sexy. So Marilyn Monroe, it doesn't really heavily depend on her beauty. In fact, the picture that's on the screen right now is very interesting in this regard. This picture was never released till much, much later. Because she doesn't look that great in it. She's got a weird kind of double chin thing going on. Her arm looks really hairy. So Marilyn Monroe used to pad her bra. She wasn't really like perfectly beautiful. There's many women that look as beautiful as Marilyn Monroe. But there's very, 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 very few, if any, women in history who have the same charisma and attractiveness that she did. And that's what you really see here, even in this basic summary of her houses. That there's 3 is off the chart, and 5 is off the chart, and 11 is off the chart, and 3, 5, and 11 together is really bold and entertaining and pleasure-oriented and sexy. I hope this helped you better understand at least one of the techniques and systems that's involved in this great new report of mine, the Houses of Life. If you want to see how these things come together for you, then go to victakara.com/H and order your own report today. Thanks very much.